communication with athletes is obviously the topic of our talk. Communication is a vital life skill. It's something that we need as human beings, not just as coaches, but of course, from a coaching perspective, communication is of utmost importance. Obviously, we communicate with each other as co-coaches. We most importantly communicate with our athletes. We instruct, we encourage, we discipline, we organize, and we expect not only solid and good communication skills of ourselves, but also of our athletes as well. Importantly, when we examine the research on performance, teams that promote positive communication and respect see greater motivation where goal achievement is concerned. So we know that effective communication within a team environment, whether you're an individual sport or a team sport, really enhances indirectly enhances performance through things like cohesion and all of those other sort of important aspects of teams that we know lead to better performance. So what is communication? Sorry, I'm having some troubles here. Communication is really, as Jermaine suggested last week in his talk, as we think about good planning as the secret to success, which is what Jermaine identified good planning as, while that's important, what's even more important is good communication. And some have said that good communication is actually the key to success, because you have to be able to relay that good planning to your athletes in some logical fashion. And again, a lot of people have suggested that communication is actually the most important element for us as coaches. So as coaches, as we think about the ways that we are going to communicate, the basic definition really is the process of passing information and understanding from one person to another. Communication has a lot of different definitions, but as we look at this more general, it really is about understanding what's expressed by others. In other words, the communication process involves sending and receiving messages, and it can take many forms. It involves not only the content of a message, but also thinking about the emotional impact or the effect that a message has on the person receiving it. In sport, there's a number of reasons for us to communicate. Most relevant are interactions we have, as I mentioned before, with other coaches, with administrators. Our key element of communication has to be with our athletes, but we also expect that those athletes have good communication amongst one another. For those of us in a team sport, that becomes even more relevant for us. But there's also other types of communication and interactions that we find ourselves involved in. We may find ourselves involved in advertising, marketing, trying to build excitement about a program through the mobilization of fans or supporters. So there's lots of different reasons for us to communicate. And the question for each of us is, how are we going to do that? And what are we going to say when we engage in communication? A lot of people think they communicate well. I've heard people say, or coaches say, yeah, just go over there. No, don't do that. Pass the ball now. Or one of the most common things we hear in soccer and maybe even in other sports, when you're in the game and you hear your athletes talking to each other, a lot of time all you hear is one word. You hear yep. It's the most common word we hear during in-play in soccer. And the question is that really communication? Well, yeah, it's some form of communication. The question for each of us to ask is that effective communication? So when we add the word effective to our definition, we really change the way that we look at communication. So effective communicators are really able to send messages that really clearly convey the intended content and are received in the right way or the desired way. And that's exactly how we need to be able to coach. Regardless of the age or skill or experience of our athletes, we have to be able to get our message across in a number of situations to a number of athletes, and in some instances to a large number of athletes at the same time. So as a coach, the most important judgment you need to make is whether a message actually needs to be sent. Sometimes we talk too much, definitely. I mean, here, I'm doing a session on communication, and unfortunately it's me talking to you. Sometimes we ramble on about things that bore others, or we distract athletes during practice. Some coaches talk too little, the other extreme, assuming that others know what they think or what they want. So we all have communication strengths and weaknesses. The key to good, effective communication is both knowing when to communicate and what and how you're going to get your message across. So over the next little while, we will talk about how we actually go about engaging in the process of communication. What are some of the keys to effective communication, and how we may involve ourselves well in the sort of second part of communication, which is listening, because we'll find out shortly that listening is a struggle for a lot of us. So how do we actually communicate? There's two basic ways that we can identify most forms of communication. The first is verbal. Verbal communication seems like the most obvious of the different types of communication. It utilizes spoken word, either face-to-face or, in the event of what we're doing right now, remotely. Verbal communication is essential to most interactions, but there are other, what we call nonverbal cues, that help provide additional context to the words that we verbally communicate. So oftentimes we pair nonverbal communication with the spoken word to provide a little bit more of a nuanced message. Nonverbal cues also speak volumes. They provide some insight into the words we choose to use. You may use things like sarcasm or complacency or deception within your nonverbal communication. And those are things that can be communicated through facial expressions, hand gestures, the posture that you assume, and even your appearance. For instance, somebody who's disheveled with, wrinkled and poorly matching shorts and top and stands very poorly would probably communicate a lack of confidence, or in some cases, a lack of expertise. Whereas a coach with a matching training suit in the right color with the right logo on it, who stood up straight and speaks very clearly, is probably somebody who you may take a little bit more serious and consider to be a little bit more knowledgeable. There's another set of communicators that we use as coaches quite frequently, and those are also forms of nonverbal that we call visual communicators. Visual types or styles of communication include signs or drawings that use color or graphics, and they really reinforce some of the verbal communication, and they help us to make a point. They help a speaker, for example, to remember some important topics. Some of you use lesson planning, and you may have a cue card, or you carry your actual lesson plan with you. They help you to remember some of the more important coaching points in your lesson. Sometimes they give the audience or athlete something to look at. So we may use a coaching board, for example. But generally, these visual cues will help us to relay the message that we want to be presented. And again, they're oftentimes considered to be nonverbal forms of communication. So take a moment now and just think to yourself, when you are a listener or a learner and you're receiving information verbally and non-verbally, and make a little bit of a mental note as to which of the two you get the most out of. Which of the two do you, as a learner or listener, feel conveys the most information to you? And that will have some relevance later on in the talk, as we talk a little bit more about how these two styles of communication break down for our athletes. Also, possibly for us, and what we feel about these two styles of communication. So we'll focus for a bit on verbal, and then we'll move over to nonverbal, and eventually we'll get into talking about what makes us more effective in using these kinds of communication. So as a quick reminder, communication is the process of passing information and understanding from one person to another. And so this graphic really gives you a little bit of a very basic idea of how we may pass some of that information and understanding from one person to another. It does focus on the verbal, and I'm going to go back to it later on as we look at the listener. But if we focus on the verbal forms of communication, when we speak, we intend to convey a message. And our hope is that that message has an impact. So as you move along this graphic, you'll see that that's really what our overall goal is. When we speak with some rules, or we speak under the influence, so to speak, of things like articulation. So can we clearly pronounce words clear enough so that the listener may understand what we're saying? Do we have a fluency in how we speak? Is there flow in the way that our words match with one another? But then we also have all these rules of language. So we have basic rules of grammar. So normalized rules of things that we in our society in Canada, for example, Western Canada, expect to hear within the grammar. Those rules of grammar will change as we move across the country and into other countries themselves. We also have rules of language that suggest that there's a way that words are supposed to go together. And those will, sometimes we understand those, sometimes we don't, sometimes we use them properly, sometimes we don't. And the final piece is what we call pragmatic. So it's about what do we mean when we use words? So sometimes the same word can have different meanings, right? And so when we say a word, does it actually mean what we think it means? And as a speaker, that says one thing, but then if we include that word in a message, what does that mean to the listener? So verbal communication is about understanding how to use some of these rules, if you want to call them, or how we're influenced by some of these pieces. The other thing you'll notice is that there are filters, and those are filters that both the speaker and the listener have. And oftentimes those filters are the same. So we may share some similar filters. So for example, we may share environmental filters where we are outside or we're in a very noisy indoor environment. And that filter of noise will influence how I speak and what I say and how the listener hears and the message that's relayed. But we also have filters that are specific to each and every one of us. So our speaker may, for example, have a filter that he or she may have an accent, and that acts as a filter to not only influence language and pragmatics, but how that message then gets relayed to the listener. We also have a filter in terms of our own understanding of language and the grammatical rules we may or may not have learned when we were younger. So those are some of the pieces that really influence us from a verbal perspective. Non-verbally, so the other side of the coin, is that we have these other cues. And as a coach, you say a lot without even saying a single word. So a look of disbelief, a shake of your head, or a smile can communicate a lot. So in addition to becoming aware of the words that you use, it's essential that you become aware of your tone and the nonverbal behaviors that you use in communicating with your athletes. Lou Holtz is a very popular and famous American college football coach. He spent a year in the pros, but he spent most of his career in the colleges. And he tells a pretty interesting story about his coaching experience at Notre Dame. His recruiting coordinator came up to him one year and decided he wanted to develop a video to help him recruit student athletes. So, Holtz thought, it's a good video, but maybe the recruiting coordinator could include some clips of him having positive interactions with his players. So he sent the recruiting coordinator away, and he came back and he said, well, I can't find any. And Lou Holtz was actually a bit exacerbated by that because he really prided himself on being what he thought was a positive coach and sending these really positive messages. So ultimately what happened was that this experience helped him, Holtz, become more aware of his interactions with his players and discover a pathway to becoming a more effective communicator. So like him, interestingly enough, even though he's a fairly high profile coach, we oftentimes are unaware of the messages that we give our student athletes, non-verbally. This is probably best explained in a study that was done in Britain that discovered that they did it on male coaches, and they asked male coaches whether they felt that their style of communication was predominantly verbal or non-verbal. And the majority of the coaches came back and said, well, no, I use mostly verbal communication. And thinking about us as coaches, we spend a lot of time giving technical information. So it's very likely that we all have this perception of ourselves as giving quite a bit of verbal communication. And they didn't think they used nonverbal communication very often at all. But when they asked the players, the players felt that the coaches' styles were predominantly nonverbal. And so, we have to be aware of that. And by the same token, athletes also communicate nonverbally. And we have to learn to be more effective listeners and communicators by becoming astute observers of some of the nonverbal pieces that our athletes may use. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. So if we go back to the question that I asked you earlier about whether you feel that you use verbal or nonverbal communication and you get more out of it, the information that you find is more relevant to you in your learning process. I'll tell you why that's important. It's important because we have this rule in communication. It's called the 738-55 rule. I know the numbers are kind of odd, but they do add up to 100. The 738-55 rule suggests that in communication, we overwhelmingly feel that our attitudes and beliefs about what someone says, it's not actually the words that they use, it's actually their tone of voice and their body language. So it's the other nonverbal pieces that people use. So a very, very small percentage, 7% of what we take from words or what we value from communication are actually based on the words that people say. And for us, and again, I'll mention again, for us in very highly technical aspects, we need to be able to use those words really efficiently, because if we don't, they may get lost in translation. 38% of the information that's gathered is from the pitch and the tone of people's voices, the speed and the rhythm of the spoken word, and the pauses that you use between words really express a lot more about what you're communicating compared to the actual words themselves. And the last one there speaks specifically, as you can see, to the types of movements that we may use or the types of postures that we may assume as we're speaking. Those are the sort of subtle signals, and they're really the nonverbal elements that present listeners with really important cues to what our thoughts and feelings are. And they, in some ways, can substitute or contradict what our speaker's words are. Nonverbal elements are particularly important for communicating if they don't agree with the words. So when you have body language, for example, somebody says, well, I don't have a problem with you, but they're looking away, they're looking kind of anxious, they're, kind of have a closed body posture. When those two things don't match, then your listener, or your viewer in this case, is probably going to use your body language more than anything. So the 738-55 rule, again, suggests that there's a really small percentage of understanding that comes from the words that we use. So we have to be really, really careful in how we use words and what they might actually mean. So let's talk a little bit about effective verbal communication then, and how we might be able to recognize that small 7% and give it more value than maybe we actually are. So the question for us is, what are we actually saying? And again, I've mentioned it before. I think it's worth repeating. The amount of technical information, oftentimes technical, tactical, those types of pieces that we have to give as coaches suggests that there are some potential ways that that information can actually be heard. And because the nonverbal is so important, those words have to really follow some rules. So the first is what we call positive and honest. And I'll talk about the no buts in a moment. So an effective way to correct a performance, because we do spend a lot of time correcting errors too, right? So we see something happen, we want to give some feedback on it. That's very, very common. It's probably what we spend most of our time doing. So the most effective way to correct a performance error is really to first point out the parts of the technique or tactics that the athlete performed correctly, and then explain in a positive way, which is, here comes your honesty, the error that the athlete made, and show them the correct way to do it using words. So, and then we always finish by some form of encouragement. So in other words, you may feel like saying, way to wash the ball into your glove, but when you throw to first, be sure to push your legs back so you can get a little bit more zip on the ball. You've all experienced some type of feedback where you've had to give an athlete that type of encouragement. So saying it that way, what you've done is you've included what we call a negative connector, and that's where the no buts comes in. So you've said something, good job, way to watch the ball into your glove, but the next time you do it, so that sort of negative connector is the thing that we want to try to avoid. Because when you include a negative connector, what that does is it forces the athlete, or the athlete tends to, I should say, focus a little bit more on the negative statement versus the positive statement. Negative connectors include things like buts. So buts probably the most common one. You may use the word instead. Sometimes we get a little bit more aggressive and we say, well, can't you? Good pass, but can't you do it this way next time? So when you're giving that type of feedback, think about taking away those negative connectors so that the athlete will have a little bit more time thinking about the positive piece that you just gave him or her, and a little bit less time on that what they would assume to be negative. Although it's constructive feedback most of the time, they see that as a bit negative. The second is something I'm sure you've all heard before, which is the sort of KISS principle, keep it short and simple. May also call it clear and simple, because clear is also very, very important. So organize your thoughts before you speak to your athletes. Know your subject. Explain yourself thoroughly, but again, don't bore your athletes. Make sure as well that you use language your athletes can understand, and try to be consistent with the language that you use. Those of you that coach younger athletes or less technically advanced athletes, you may be able to use less technical information or less words, or you may struggle with using words that younger athletes or less technical athletes can understand. But it's very important that you develop an arsenal for yourself and you have a series of words that you can use with those athletes. Say it loud and say it again. And although we talk about not repeating yourself too much, it is important. Sometimes, if you're going to use a nice, strong, vigorous voice, that's very helpful compared to a garbled, weak speech that most athletes will probably tune out. The only time it's okay to maybe soften your voice, you may think of instances where you need to talk to an individual athlete and maybe you need to talk to them about something that's less technically related. Those are times maybe you use a slightly softer voice. But in most instances, we're trying to relay a very important message and we need to use a very strong voice. Say it again. Do you have to say it the same way? No. Can you find a different way? You're knowledgeable in your sport. Can you find a different way that simplifies or changes the way that you've explained it? Maybe the first way that you explained it wasn't clear enough or wasn't in terminology that your athlete could understand. So always think that way. The other way to do it is to use another athlete. Did you see somebody else who performed the skill? Maybe ask them, if somebody asks you to repeat it, so ask that other athlete, tell us about how you executed that skill. And maybe they're able to use words that could help you understand where the message may have been gone off track a bit. The last cue is to be consistent. And, we oftentimes we say things that imply different messages. For example, you may use a bit of sarcasm. So there's a real big difference between saying, way to go, and way to go. So that sort of subtle change in tone sends an entirely different message than the words themselves. And again, although it goes back to a little bit of that nonverbal piece, there's little subtleties in the way that we use definitions of words. One year, for example, we used the word force to indicate direction of pressure that we wanted on the soccer pitch. And at one point, one of the student athletes, rightly so, said to us, well, do you mean that's where you want the ball to go? Or do you mean that's where you want the ball to not go? And it made sense, right? I mean, the word force means something to us, but it may not necessarily mean the same thing. So being consistent and making sure that your entire coaching staff is using the same terminology is very, very important. Now, when you do provide feedback, that is the question, when, the word when. When Do you actually provide feedback? A lot of a lot of people vary in this, but the research generally suggests that the most important time to provide feedback is immediately after you've seen something. And you'll notice that I've got the word good in all caps and errors in all small, mostly because we forget to oftentimes or ignore providing feedback after something good is performed. And that's actually one of the most important times. So we're going to talk a bit about good and error in a minute, but let's focus on the when first of all. So immediately after something is done is the best opportunity to provide feedback. Why? Because it's present and the athlete will have a context for what just happened. Unless you have video review and you can go after it, review that and go about breaking down an athlete's performance, it's really hard to, at halftime, for example, in a game in soccer, it's 45 minutes, obviously, or more. So at halftime, to be able to go back to something that was at the 22nd minute, that's the most challenging time to provide some forms of feedback because you don't have the immediate idea and affect for the athlete. And sometimes even if you do have video review, it may not be the most opportune time to provide some forms of feedback. Generally speaking, immediately after. I mentioned before that providing good feedback after good performance is really, really important. You reward through immediate encouragement and showcase how you appreciate the effort, the concentration, the skill execution, linking it to why it worked and how this helped them. There's always that sort of, okay, that was awesome. Very good job. Is there a way that we can transition that the next time and move the ball forward a little bit faster? So every positive thing that you do and say really sticks in an athlete's memory and builds up their confidence over time. That's really what helps them with that notion that they have some self-worth and have some self-value in the sport. The other piece to that is if we don't reward or if we don't praise or we don't give positive feedback to good behaviors, then it's almost like we expect it all the time. And when athletes feel like we expect excellence, then it creates some challenges for them and they don't actually understand when they've done something well. Immediately after errors is probably the one time that most coaches like to provide feedback. And there's nothing wrong with that. The question is, how do we go about doing it? If you're giving them a process for improving their performance, you're using the positive and honest approach, and you're giving them a process for improving their performance rather than a process for how to do it wrong again, there's nothing wrong with that. If an athlete makes a mistake, the last thing they want to do, it's really the last thing they want to do. It's not like that they intended to make that error. They intended to do that wrong. So the concept really is for us to find a way to motivate the player to perform the correct technique rather than negatively motivate them to avoid the poor technique. And that's why we want to focus on the good. In other words, if you continuously mention only errors without giving them some positive, honest feedback, then the only thing they are performing is poorly, right? So we always have to recognize those positives. And that's the one thing that challenges us oftentimes. So in terms of verbal communication, the best way to think about it is to think about positive, correct, and encourage, where we give them some positive information, again, positive and honest. We provide them without using those negative connectors with some correcting information. And we always leave it off with some form of encouragement. That's really, really something that we look at in the literature as one of the best ways to encourage our athletes through our verbal communication. There's a couple of researchers in Washington State who've done a lot of examination, mostly on baseball coaches, but they've observed thousands of athletes and hundreds of coaches over their career. And they really found that athletes responded more positively to coaches who provided positive feedback after good performance effort. And that was something that, we all again, need to make sure that we continue to encourage. In contrast, they also found that athletes responded not surprisingly, that athletes responded unfavorably to coaches who failed to notice or reinforce good efforts. And so if we don't do enough of that positive affect after good behaviors, then we might be in a little bit of trouble in terms of how our athletes are responding to that. So in thinking about positive positive verbal communication for us as coaches, we know that there's certain ways that we would coach that are very different. We also, as I've said before, find ourselves in different situations. So we may not always be coaches. There's also occasions for us to effectively use communication outside of the direct sport context. So if we look at some of those other situations, for example, you may find yourself in a parent meeting, for example, or you may find yourself in an athlete meeting that's not directly related to a specific instance of performance. Maybe it's a more global snapshot of the performance that they're engaging in. So there are some different rules for effective verbal communication and some really effective cues as we're thinking about them. Neil, in his talk last week, mentioned this as well, and you really can't be afraid to say that you don't know something. Conversely, own it when you know you got it wrong. If you don't know something, don't guess. This is why, as we spoke about earlier, it's really incumbent upon us as coaches to know what we're going to say, to have all our ducks in a row, to be efficient in the ways that our thought processes are going to analyze certain situations. But the bottom line is we always find ourselves in situations that we don't know the answer. If you don't know the answer, say you don't know it. There's nothing wrong with trying to swamp your way through it and get things wrong in the end. Second is to use open-ended questions. Open-ended questions are very valuable. Let's say a player comes to you and they are asking you why they're not getting enough playing time. That's a really challenging question. And, sometimes you'll have your ducks in a row, and sometimes you'll be able to tell them, well, you're not good enough. But think about how that response may come across to an athlete. Is there a way that maybe you can use open-ended questions? Open-ended questions are questions that really don't have a yes or no answer. They're not very easily answered. And they're really about getting to know what the person is, what are the underlying factors that have led to that question. So a player comes to you and says they're not getting enough playing time. They want to know why they're not getting enough playing time. An open-ended question may look like this. So tell me, what does that look like to you? What does getting more minutes look like to you? How does that look like? How does that compare to our overall team plans, and what might more minutes look like to you? That allows you to know, maybe, get a little bit more information from the student athlete, from the athlete. Maybe it's not about them actually getting more time. Maybe it's about their parent wanting to know why they're not getting enough time or why they're not getting more time. Then you can sort of, think your way through getting to the root of the problem. Maybe it is about team culture and that athlete not knowing his or her role on the team. And that opens up more opportunity to discuss how playing time became the be all and end all of what their role in the program actually is. The last is be brief. Don't repeat yourself. Again, this could be the KISS principle if you want. We tend to repeat ourselves way too many times. It's very common for us as coaches because we think that athletes are not listening, or we think they need to hear it again. Again, we've mentioned before, what are some ways that we can ensure that everybody's hearing the message in a different way. So it's really important that we think about ways that we can be brief and sort of reduce the impact of some of the words that we're using. From a nonverbal perspective then, and I'm just assuming there are no questions in the chat, so I'm just going to keep going until Ian interrupts me. From a nonverbal perspective then, there are a few ways that we know that we can be a bit better in terms of being effective. The first couple are facial expressions and eye contact. Remember that only about 7% of information that athletes actually use comes from the words we say. And the majority of their feelings, attitudes, and beliefs about our coaching are actually based on these nonverbal forms of communication. So these are the pieces that we really, really need to focus on. Remember that when the look on a person's face is really the quickest clue to what he or she feels. Your athletes know this. So oftentimes, they're paying attention, they're studying your face, they're looking for what your eyes are saying, they're listening maybe, but they're really focusing on those visual cues of your face. Don't try to fool them by putting on a happy face all the time or a blank face. They'll see through you. And in many instances, you'll probably lose a bit of credibility. Some people will use a serious stone-faced expression that gives no cues to what they're actually saying or feeling. And when faced with this, a lot of athletes will really just think that you're unhappy or that you're really not interested. So you really have to find that type of facial expression that's best for you. You can't be afraid to smile. A smile from a coach will go a really long way to boosting the confidence and the esteem in an unsure athlete. A smile lets your athletes know that you're happy to be coaching them. It lets them know that you want to be there. By the same token, you can overexpress, right? So you can smile too much. There's certainly opportunities when you probably don't need to smile or you shouldn't smile. So make sure that you try to figure out what that sort of happy medium is. The next is eye contact. And although eye contact, again, it can take many forms, I want to show you a quick video that describes one of the ways that one particular program uses it. It is a university-based program, but they use eye contact and they really help their program build upon the use of both eye contact and body language.
With respect to eye contact and body language, that's something that we've really been focusing a lot on over the past couple of years at Hopkins. I just recently read a book called Presence by Amy Cuddy, and it talks a lot about how your body language and how you carry yourself can shape who you are. And for me and my team, something that's a real big focus for us is eye contact. So when I'm coaching my girls, when I'm looking at them, when I'm instructing them, when I'm teaching them, I expect all of their eyes to be on me, and I try to make eye contact across the group. So not just focusing on one girl, but make eye contact across the group. And what that says is, I care about you, I'm engaged with you, I'm paying attention to you. And then we take that a step further, not just the ability to have that eye contact. And I will even say to my girls, hey, eyes on me, so that we know that everyone's now completely engaged, but we take it to their body language, to how they carry themselves on the field. If they get beat, do they drop their head? That body language is telling everybody, I'm slumping my shoulders, I'm looking down, I'm dropping my head, that I'm not confident anymore. And that's not the message we want to send. So we're talking a lot with our young women, and I would really encourage.
Ilsa, I think we lost the audio for the last part here.
With respect to eye contact and body language, and they'll want to listen a little bit more to you as a coach, to make them aware that how they carry themselves will shape who they become. So having those shoulders back, handling themselves with confidence, standing tall, even in the face of adversity, can go a very long way. And that's something where even body language in a meeting room, when we are going over a scouting report, let's say, and if I'm speaking to my team and there's a couple of them that are chewing on their fingers, they have their hands up in their teeth and they're kind of like chewing on their thumb or their skin. And I say, get that hand away from those teeth, because this kind of appearance makes you look nervous, makes you look intimidated, makes you look like you're not paying attention, you're distracted. And it's something that's been a habit that the young women have formed over the years. And it seems little, but it's a big deal for them to understand, oh, you know what? I'm not nervous. I'm confident. I'm hearing what you're saying. I'm engaged. I want to listen. So eye contact, body language, how we carry ourselves, and what we're doing with ourselves while someone's speaking to us is something as coaches we really want to focus on.
Great. So you'll have noticed that she's transitioned into body language as well. And we know that body language is certainly one of the other key features that our athletes will cue onto us. So, what would your athlete think if you were kind of slouched in your shoulders, your head was down? Those are you tired? Are you bored? Are you unhappy? What about when you're in competition and you're standing there, and you saw some in the pictures that were on one of the previous slides where your hands are crossed across your chest, or they're on your hip, or they're in your pocket. So there's certainly ways that we use body language that will affect or really enter our athletes' minds in terms of how they're thinking about us. It's always suggested we avoid massively wild hand gestures while we're coaching. So there's obviously some positive forms of effective nonverbal communication we can use as we coach. The most important thing is for us to remember that those are really, really important cues that our athletes are actually going to pay attention to. In addition to this video, some of you may have seen a video that was taken at a press conference at the end of one of the NC2A Final Four tournament games for the women's basketball, where Gene Auriemma, who coaches in the States as well, he was talking about, he gave a very honest assessment of how he and his coaching staff look at body language of his players. He said that, in fact, when they do game tape review, they don't only game tape review the game itself. What he's most interested in is looking at the players who are on the bench and their body postures. In fact, he has flat out said, he has flat out told his athletes, you will never get in a game if your body language is bad, to the point where he's benched his top recruit one year when she first came into the league, and he wasn't happy with her body language on the bench. So we know that it's important for not only us as coaches, but it's also important for our athletes as well to be communicating good body language. So what can we do positively as we think about body language? What are some important things for us to think about doing? Probably the most important is to recognize the value of body language. So can we use our eyes? Can we use our hands? Can we stand in appropriate ways? And the other piece that we haven't talked a lot about are actually the legs. And there's lots of good literature out there that helps us understand how to more positively express ourselves with our posture, with our lower body, and help others who are watching us understand how that positive body posture contributes to what we're saying and what we're actually conveying. So as we think about...
Ilsa, we do have a question.
Okay.
How do you navigate around eye contact / body with players who come from different cultural backgrounds? And then a second part, who has to compromise in order to avoid unnecessary conflict?
Wow, two good questions. So the first piece regarding athletes who may not have the same cultural is a challenging one. Of course, you don't want to make any assumptions about people, but what you probably want to do is have the conversation at the beginning of, when you first meet a team, or you have an opportunity to first talk about communication. What I would do is I would talk about, are there any types of verbal and nonverbal communication that are not negative, that you find are negative? So you get the conversation out there and you learn from your athletes, what are some things that they may not appreciate in the way that we both verbally and non-verbally act as coaches. And the reason I suggest that method is because, again, as I said before, we don't want to make any assumptions about people's cultural background. It's always hard the more we learn about our athletes from listening to them, then the more we learn about how we can change our behavior. So that would be the way that I would approach understanding. And it doesn't necessarily have to be about cultural. It could be, any one of those filters that I spoke about earlier that a listener may have may influence how he or she views any type of nonverbal posture or our use of nonverbal communication. So I think to ask everybody in your unit, how they feel about both positive and negative communication would probably be the best route to take. The second question, sorry, Ian, can you remind me what the second question was?
Yeah, who has to compromise in order to avoid unnecessary conflict?
So I don't think you necessarily need to have any. I mean, I guess it depends on what your conflict is about. But I think, I mean, if I stick with the verbal, because I think that that's probably where we mostly have some of our impressions about conflict anyway. I think it depends. You know, I don't think you have to compromise. I think what's important is that you understand where the conflict is coming from. So I'm going to talk a little bit later on. We're getting into talking about the listener right now, and we're going to talk a bit about how we can effectively listen and what we can do as we're listening to sort of acknowledge what an athlete or what a person may be saying. And I think that that's part of it. So when you acknowledge what someone is saying, so for example, if I go back to that example where the player feels like they're not getting enough playing time, by using open-ended questions or acknowledging what they've said, and maybe, you know, we get to the point of the conversation where the player has suggested that, you know, they're getting some pressure. By acknowledging that that's a legitimate concern doesn't necessarily mean I agree with them. So I think that really what has to happen is we have to understand where the conflict comes from and try to find a way to, whether you agree with it or not, find a way to allow that conflict to continue to exist. So for example, if you're not going to play that player anymore, there's got to be a way that that player understands why. And that, you know, for us, for many of you, I'm sure playing time is a huge conflicting piece. So I don't necessarily think either one of you have to necessarily compromise. Some might suggest that if we have the conversation and the player is not in agreement with what I've said, then they may have to compromise if they eventually, you know, want to continue to participate. But I really don't think either one of you has to necessarily compromise. I really just think it's about each of you understanding the other person's concern and recognizing and appreciating that you're going to have that concern, and knowing, well, how do I move away from that? In the instance of a player who's not playing it, how can I explain to that player how he or she may get more playing time? That's really the important piece that might help to alleviate the conflict. Doesn't necessarily mean either one of us are compromising, but at least there's a pathway forward for each of you to understand how to ease the conflict that you may be perceived to be in. Okay? And again, we're going to talk a bit about that in a moment as we start talking a little bit more about listening. Listening is the other side of the coin, so to speak. And as Janine, the field lacrosse coach just talked about, we really intend to parlay certain messages, but the impact of our messages doesn't always get across. So the listener has a lot of filters as well, and they listen to things based on, you know, the perception and how they perceive the message. They also may not understand or have a different comprehension about what they've heard. Those are all very, very common problems that we have with listening itself. In terms of the listener, other filters that he or she may have include past experience. His or her gender may influence some of the ways that the message is relayed, or how they interpret, the message and the impact that has. We've talked a bit about self-perceptions today. Self-perceptions are huge. An athlete who has a lower level of self-confidence will filter a message in a very different way than an athlete who has a high level of confidence. On the other hand, an athlete who has an overabundance of confidence, because I'm sure we all know those athletes, may also filter our message in a very different way. Filters are everywhere, and we really have to sort of think about how those filters influence what we're saying. So in terms of effective listening, here's a few important things to think about. we often forget about listening, and I've said that before. We don't think we need to improve our skills as listeners because we don't realize how much it really contributes to the conversation. Interestingly, there's a fellow who has done a couple TED Talks, and hopefully you're familiar with those. You can look most of them up on YouTube, but there's a fellow named Julian Treasure who has done a couple TED Talks. He's done one that's called How to Speak So People Want to Listen. And he's done a follow-up to that, called The Keys to Listening. His TED Talk on how to speak so people want to listen has 27 million views. His TED Talk on the keys to listening has 2.9 million views. It really sort of underscores the value that people have in the speaker part of communication. And yes, that's very important, but I also believe, and many people believe, that being a good listener is just as equally important. And that's challenging for us because we do spend a lot more time on the other end of it, but it's important for us to recognize how a listener can be more effective. The first is to pay attention, and it may seem slightly obvious, but in today's mobile technology days, we can't be multitasking. We can't, although some of you are probably single coaches, you don't have a large coaching staff to help you, but when we are in an important conversation, it's very important that we pay attention. We have to pay attention because it will really help us focus on the words that are being said. Although the words are not necessarily what we're going to focus on, we need to spend time focusing on them. Another speaker who I've listened to before, her name is Celeste Headley. She says that you should enter every conversation assuming that you have something to learn. And that's the best way to think about paying attention, because you want to be interested in other people. You want to understand. Most of us, we don't listen with the intent to understand. We listen with the intent to reply. We want to have a reply ready, right? But if we can pay attention to the words and the what we see and hear, then we may get more out of those conversations. The second is to be understanding. We have to understand and sort of figure out some of the underlying thoughts or opinions that people have when they're talking. For example, you have a team member that appears, or an athlete that appears angry after you've given them a performance review, but they say to you, well, yeah, I understand. I'll work harder on those things. So if you're a really perceptive leader, you probably look at some of the ways that they have acted, some of the body language, maybe some of the things that the way that they've said the words they've said, and you probably note that, maybe they're not really okay with it. And what does that really mean? That's very, very important, right? So judge the situation from that person's perspective and remind yourself that that person has really had a lot of different life experiences, and maybe it's time to start to draw that out. So how do we actually draw that out of them if we hear that or if we feel that in them? And the way to do that is to show you're listening. So to show you were listening means that you will, and this is where we're sort of talking about before, maybe you're going to acknowledge anything that you saw. So in that particular example, I might say to the athlete, you could say to the athlete, well, it kind of sounds like maybe you are having a little bit of a hard time with it. Get the impression maybe you're frustrated and maybe the review wasn't what you thought it was going to be. And maybe the athlete would say to you, yep, I actually thought I was having a good season. I thought I was playing well. I didn't really think that I had a lot to work on. Maybe then you could sort of rephrase what they've said, what you've just heard, so you know what it is, that you know that they've heard you, right? So, well, can you tell me how you feel about the review? You know darn well that they're not feeling 100% satisfied with the review, but you want to hear it. Can you tell me a little bit more about? So you rephrase exactly what you've just said to them or they've just said to you. And the last piece would be to finally ask some form of clarifying question that maybe gets right down to the nitty gritty. Well, it kind of sounds like you're pretty upset. Can you give me an example of what aspect of your game you think has improved and why this performance review may not be as we've stated it would be? So those three pieces really show that you're listening to the person. And this is the part I was saying before, where you don't necessarily, when you acknowledge, you don't necessarily have to agree. You're not, by acknowledging what somebody says, doesn't mean that you're giving up your freedom, so to speak, to disagree with what they're saying, right? It certainly leaves you with a lot of options. You can agree with them, you can disagree with them, you can say to them, well, you know, you're maybe we should explore other aspects of your performance. You're still not agreeing with them, but you're suggesting and you're leaving open the opportunity for them to continue the conversation. So it is important for us to start to understand how to be an effective listener and not simply be just waiting for our chance to respond, waiting for our chance to say something, but more so to recognize how to be a little bit more effective. We really need to understand our athletes' perspectives. That's really the key here. So if we think about the whole piece, putting everything together, our very first talk, Dave Wachnick mentioned that, you know, your who plus your what equals your why plus your how. And that's what drives your culture. What we're talking about here is how. And that's a super important part of your why, because you can't express your why. You can't get across what you've planned for your program if you can't effectively communicate that. It is probably the most significant part of carrying out your plan, of ensuring that you have a good culture for your team. As a coach, you have to be able to communicate effectively, or unfortunately, you probably won't be a very successful coach. So remember to use words to your advantage. We only have a very small opportunity to make words count, so we have to use them to our advantage. Never forget or ignore the impact of body language or nonverbal communication, and be a good listener. Be prepared to be amazed by every conversation that you have with people, and be prepared to understand what's happening. Don't simply get ready to reply. Be prepared to be absolutely amazed. Remember, communication is a two-way street, and we're very good at getting in our own way. But if we use some proper rules and think about these rules, then we have a better chance of success.
Okay, we'll just give it a minute or so to see if we have one come in. What are ways that you can monitor the effectiveness of your own communication in the moment?
Good question. So it takes a lot of work because it takes other people, but one of the ways that you can monitor your own, not necessarily the effect per se, but one of the ways you can monitor yourself is to have somebody either count or watch or listen or record. The best way to do is actually to record yourself coaching and to listen to how you, the words that you use, the way that you use those words, and really have a good opportunity to reflect upon what you said. It's really challenging to just take it. It's like anything, right? Video review has been awesome for us from a coaching perspective, and as from a technical and tactical piece with respect to gameplay. But one of the best ways to understand ourselves is to actually videotape ourselves and be able to hear ourselves coaching. And there's a really good tool called the Coaching Behavior Assessment System, CBAS. The Coaching Behavior Assessment System looks at the verbal words that we use, and it so you could record yourself, you could look at the Coaching Behavior Assessment System chart, and basically as you listen to yourself speak, somebody can record what kinds of terms you're using and how you're using them. And then you could go back to the video as well, and you could watch yourself and look at some of those. The nonverbal pieces you have to videotape, but the verbal pieces, we can use tools like those to help ourselves understand where we may need to change. So the Coaching Behavior Assessment System, for example, may tell you, well, you use a lot of negative terms, or you focus on individuals too much, and you use too much negative language towards individuals. So that's one piece that you could use.
Okay, we have another one. We have been using the sandwich positive, negative, positive approach to correcting performance. I understand that using positive and honest with not buts is a better approach.
Yeah, because, and I mean, you can incorporate that into the sandwich very easily by simply taking away those negative connectors and ensuring that you're providing that feedback, that really good technical or tactical feedback that you need without this negative connector. That's really the challenging part, because as soon as you include that negative connector, your athletes will then, they won't listen, they won't hear, because that negative connector just negates every positive thing you've just said. So the sandwich technique is really, really good. It really is just about the connectors that you use. Yeah.
Okay, next one. How do you keep your competition communication consistent to your other types of communication?
Yes. That's a challenging one. It's a good question, and mostly because that competition piece really drives not only the athlete, but it also drives us. And what I find too is our body language really changes when we're in competition, and we don't have as many opportunities. No, let me rephrase that. We find ourselves in more negative body language situations during competition, and the same can be said with verbal. And I think, if we go back to the whole idea that we're taking out those negative connectors and really focusing on, and the hard part too is the immediacy. And I think for those of you who are in sports where you don't have immediate access to your athletes, it is a challenge to try to focus on the feedback piece more frequently than all the errors and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of things that happen when we incorporate competition. And the other piece too, that which is a huge filter for our listeners, for our athletes, is when they're in that competitive environment as well, they tend to be, they get into their flow. And when they're in that flow, it's really hard to sort of to want to give them any feedback, but also to encourage them to hear the feedback that they have. So competition itself as an environment is a massive filter that really influences how we relay messages and how we listen to them. In terms of how you can avoid the vortex of competition and the words you use, sometimes it's about practice, right? So sometimes it's about constantly focusing on getting rid of including the positive, the feedback, and then the encouragement, and just getting into a habit as a coach of reinforcing that for yourself. The more you can continue to use those habits, then you may catch yourself in that competitive environment, and you may then be able to remind yourself, okay, no, let's go back to the positive, the feedback, the encouragement. But for each and every one of us, yeah, that competition piece, it's this like sort of like little beast that hangs out on one of our shoulders that forces us into these bad behaviors. And I think we have to do a better job in alleviating ourselves from those.
Okay, that looks like the final question. I'd like to thank Ilsa for her, oh, sorry. Oh, more of a comment for you, Ilsa, so you can look at that after.
Well, thanks.
But thank you, Ilsa, and thank you everyone for taking part. Next week, Pronghorn swim coach Peter Shorey will present on coaching individual performance in the team environment.